everyone, it's Dr. Namani and Dr. Louie back here today with the Athlete Spine, and we're really excited to have probably the most famous sports spine surgeon on the planet, probably, Dr. Watkins IV, who is, and I actually had to write this down because there are so many teams he takes care of that I don't want to miss any. So he's the director of the Marina Spine Center, and he is the team spine surgeon for the Dodgers, the Rams, the Lakers, the Clippers, the Angels, the Kings, LAFC, the Ducks, the Chargers, and USC. So we are really privileged to have you here today. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. And I do take care of all those teams. Some of them I'm not entirely official. So I don't know who considers me official or not, but most of them I have a pass. And yeah, and I worked with my dad for 20 years. He pretty much just retired, and my dad is Robert Watkins III, and I'm the fourth. And he was the first spine surgeon treating athletes. You know, that was back with Wayne Gretzky and Troy Aikman, and you know, and so he really was a pioneer in this field. And then we worked together for 20 years and took care of Peyton Manning and Rob Gronkowski and Dwight Howard, and it's been a great practice. We see guys from all over the country, but we take care of all the LA teams, and so it's busy. You know, you're in locker rooms. It's not just, they don't just show up for the surgery. 90% of the athletes we treat, we don't operate on. You know, I'm in a locker room. A guy has 1 day history of neck pain, and I go see him as the surgeon. I go see him to put him on steroids and start some PT, and 90% of them don't need surgery. And so part of that treating athletes is, it's a labor of love where you've got to enjoy getting texts and phone calls 24 hours a day. I get calls all the time like, hey, you did surgery on this guy 2 months ago. Can he throw 60 feet yet? Can he throw off the mound? Can he do soft toss? You know, all these things that we don't have any idea what they're talking about. You got to learn. You got to figure it out. And it's fun when you're treating an athlete, get involved with the training staff. You learn what they have to do their job and how to integrate that into the rehab, you know, to work them back. And we developed the app called the Back Doctor it's free, and it's got all the rehab in it, which is quantitated. So it allows us to kind of guide people back to that. So it's a lot of fun. You know, most of my practice, 90% of my patients are just normal people with neck and back pain, but the athletes is really time demanding and a fun part that makes it interesting, because whatever you do in a normal person, like you do the same stuff in the athlete, but it's hyper magnified in the athletes.
Right.
And relating to what we're going to talk about today with the artificial disc first fusions, you know, if you're going to do a surgery in an athlete, you better believe it's going to last and it's going to work and it's not going to explode while they're on national TV. You have to trust the device. And it really tells you what you believe in or not. Are you willing to put it into an NFL player who's going to be playing on TV next weekend? You got to trust the device.
Your work is a lot more scrutinized than the vast majority of spine surgeons out there, you know, because everyone knows who did it. And if there's a problem, everyone's going to know who did it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. My dad took care of a player, and my dad was all worried about it. And his friend, who's a spine surgeon, said, yeah, this could be a career ending, you know, situation. And my dad said, yeah, I feel so bad for the player. And his friend said, I'm not talking about the player. I'm talking about you. Career ending surgery for you. You know,
Yeah. Well, and it got perfectly into what we want to talk about today, because, I mean, people have been talking about disc replacements a lot, right? It's all over the news. We've seen some more higher profile athletes, you know, start talking about it and had that surgery done. But we've been also, and we had Dr. Armen Khachatryan on recently, you know, sort of presenting the case for disc replacements in high impact and collision athletes. But we still have to remind ourselves that if we look at the vast majority of like professional athletes who've had cervical spine pathology and some sort of instrumented surgery, it's a fusion they've had. And so, you know, and you've brought it up briefly sort of in your early statements as to, this is the gold standard. We know what the outcome is. This may be a result we can trust more, but you know, I'd love to hear your thought process when it comes to deciding, hey, okay, at this point, this athlete has a cervical spine problem, the nerves are pinched, we need to do some sort of surgery from the front. At this point, what is going through your mind and your thought process?
Yeah, and it's obviously always evolving. And you could interview me every 3 to 6 months, and it'd be a little bit different based on, especially if I see something go wrong, then it tends to change our opinion a bit. But the bottom line is that artificial disc replacements in my patients, my general patients, my everyday patients I treat from age 20 to 80. I do probably 80 to 85% artificial discs instead of fusions. So I still do fusion. I'm mainly doing ADRs and just about everybody and getting good results. It's a great surgery. In athletes, I've done 4 UFC fighters with cervical artificial discs. So talking about trusting a device, I trust the artificial disc, and I've done a Pro Disc C, I've done a Medtronic Prestige, and I've done a Simplify in UFC fighters. So I trust them all enough to put it in. Somebody's going to try and rip their head off. I mean, UFC is almost as hardcore as the NFL. So anyway, I do a lot of artificial disc, but at the same time, the fusion's an excellent surgery because a lot of these guys, especially high impact, like football players, the average NFL career is 3 years. So if you're going to operate on somebody, the number one thing is you have to do the safest surgery, has the best chance of helping their spinal cord, helping the nerve, being stable after 6 months, where they can go back and literally lower their head like a battering ram and ram into another person, 250 pounds, who does a 4-4. Boom. Like, football is a battle for inches, and no other sport quite has that same desire. And there's no question, if you lower your head like a battering ram, you will generate more power and gain that extra inch.
Right.
So you can talk to a player and say, you can't lower your head, you can't spear somebody with your head, and they'll go, yeah, I got that. Well, in the fourth quarter, with the playoffs on the line, and they're going to lower their head, because that is how the human body generates the most power. And so, so you've got to assume it's going to happen. And can your surgery hold up to that type of impact? And so NFL is still a little bit different than every other sport in my mind, due to that little factor that matters. And I've been on the sideline of games. It's gnarly. The hits that happen are really intense, and you don't quite get those with the other sports. UFC, hockey, other sports can be safer. Now there's other more violent sports like skiing, or, where you can have a really violent collision, but they're less frequent. Football, every play, people are ramming into each other. And so, that's what makes NFL a little bit different. And so in those regards, we've had great success doing fusions in NFL players. We have 80% have gone back to play their sport, usually around 8 to 9 months. And this is kind of older data. I think it's a little bit higher than that, a little bit faster. And I tell them the return is typically around 6 months now. 6 to 8 months probably is a safe range. And so a fusion's a good thought. We did it on Peyton Manning, and he came back and won a Super Bowl and an MVP. And, and so if this man's career and his livelihood is dependent on going back to a sport and making $5 to $100 million over the next 3 years so that he can be set for his life, a fusion gives you a good chance of doing that. The chance of getting an adjacent level problem after a fusion, I say, is around 20%. And so, and usually in most people, that's in 10 years. One, a football player, that's probably 5 years, cut it in half, even 3 to 5 years. Well, does that allow them to get their next contract, be successful for the rest of their life? And then if they get an adjacent level problem, so the fusion stiffens up that one segment, you put more stress on the other levels, the next level falls apart, has to have surgery. Well, I've told guys, well, you could have an artificial disc at the next level and retire and be pretty good. I mean, if somebody has a one-level fusion and artificial disc, hybrid, and they're 28 years or 30 years old, they should be okay for their life. So that's a pretty safe alternative. And so, the big discussion that came out with Jack Eichel, the hockey players, when it came on to ESPN, everybody was talking about fusion artificial disc. The thing that I kind of regret about that situation is that it was kind of presented as though the fusion was this archaic, barbaric type of construct, and the artificial disc is great and amazing. And that's just not the truth. The truth is they're both good surgeries. They both work. They both have 80 to 90% success rate. There's pluses and minuses to both. And most of us do both in patients, depending on subtleties.
Yeah. I had that same discussion today with a 42-year-old, about, single level cervical problem. And look, they're both good operations. They both have a pretty good track record now. They just have different risks and benefits. I think your point about talking with an athlete or a patient about their unique goals, right? Everyone's got different life circumstances, and how do you maximize the potential for that person to get whatever recovery they need that's going to be best for them, on whatever timeline that's right for them.
And they're both good options. I mean, the reality, the artificial disc, so the downside of the artificial disc is we don't know this driving head-to-head impact, what might happen to the artificial disc. And quite frankly, we haven't figured out which artificial disc is the best yet. Like I said, I've done all three different kinds in the UFC. They all have their pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
Well, so, which one's going to be the most stable? Now, the other thing that I would say that's I think is relevant to the discussion is I think my calculations has been there's been 1 to 2 million cervical artificial discs done worldwide to date. And I kind of just made that number up. I would love to know the facts.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what I extrapolated, and it's probably safe bet. 1 to 3 million, I think may be accurate. Well, how many catastrophic events have there been where you've had a fracture dislocation and dislodgement of the artificial disc and somebody ended up paralyzed? Because that's what we're worried about.
Right.
I've only heard of one. There's somebody published one, like some type of accident that happened. It was an incomplete paralysis after a failed artificial disc, So, and that's good. And my point about that is the years go on and we get more millions of artificial discs and weekend warriors and 40 and 50-year-old people that are getting in car accidents and not ending up paralyzed. Well, then it's safer. Then maybe I'd feel more comfortable about an NFL player. Doing artificial discs, but you just need a little more data, need a little more time in history.
Yeah. I know everyone kind of held their breath last year during the Stanley Cup playoffs when Jack Eichel took that big hit, I think every spine surgeon looked at that and said, gosh, I hope that disc stayed together,
Well, his doctor, who was the big proponent of the artificial disc, I saw a quote like on ESPN or something where he said, "Oh, I held my breath and I was worried." Where it was interesting where, it was kind of like, well, if you were worried, then maybe it made a little sense why the team doctor didn't want to do it. Because if the guy had a fusion, you wouldn't have been worried about it.
It's true.
So it's but anyway, so one of those gray zone factors.
And speaking of fusion, like we hear from our young patients all the time, right? You hear about fusion everywhere else in the spine and you think stiff, right? You're going to lose range of motion. And these athletes are like, wait, no, I depend on my ability to have a range of motion and to react. What do you tell your young patients and these athletes when they ask you, won't a fusion restrict my range of motion and make me stiff over time?
Yeah, and I don't think that's as much of a concern. I mean, we're talking about a single level neck.
Single level, right?
The single level neck fusion. My patients do not complain of a lack of range of motion after single.
And that's sort of our experience too with a single.
And I think that's pretty well demonstrated. The fusion versus the artificial disc papers do not report that the artificial disc patients have more range of motion.
Right.
The main two factors they get are return to work faster and better patient satisfaction. Which satisfaction, they get the artificial disc, they're really happy they got it, so they're super satisfied.
Right. It's a hard
measuring factor. And then the return to work, well, they go back to work as soon as the doctor lets them go back. And so the doctor lets them go back sooner. So, one other thing I thought was an interesting story is I had an NFL kicker who was kind of later in his career and wasn't signed with the team, had a neck issue, came to me, well-informed, told me he wanted an artificial disc replacement. He had done all the research. And I went through it all and I said, look, a fusion's more, and this was like 5 years ago. And I said, look, a fusion's more, bread and butter. I said, but at the same time, you're a kicker. You're well-informed. I think an artificial disc and a kicker in the NFL would be okay. And I said, if you're the last man standing, you got to just let him go. You can't lower it. And I learned the kicker goes, oh yeah, I won't do that. I'll let him go. I realized that you can't trust them to say that because in a game situation, they're going to lower their head. But my point is, I thought he was a reasonable guy. These are adults we're dealing with.
Yeah, that's true.
So if they're well-informed and they know the whole situation, don't they get to pick what gets put in their body, on some level? I agree with that. And so I did a pro disc C in him. I did an artificial disc. And then guess what? No NFL team. He only tried out for a couple of NFL teams. They didn't sign him. Now, did they not sign him because their team medical staff was weary of the artificial disc? And they might have had two kickers very similar. He had the artificial disc. The other guy didn't. So maybe they just went with the other guy. But then he also tried to sign on with like the XFL and they wouldn't sign him.
Oh, really? Oh.
Right. And so it kind of tells you that, it's one thing for us as spine surgeons to have a theoretic discussion about, hey, do artificial disc or not? Yeah, but we're not paying the bill.
Right.
Who's the employer going to be? If the employer and the league and the team doctor don't want to take the chance, well, it doesn't matter. Like you got to know that. You got to know the sport.
Well, it's really interesting that I mean, this obviously played out in recent years, in the NHL, right? And the Vegas Golden Knights were kind of willing to take that leap of faith, as the first team to have a player on their roster who had an artificial disc, and so whereas the Sabres didn't want that, and so do you think there's ever going to be a day where both a surgeon and a team make the leap, perhaps in a high profile athlete to have a NFL player have an artificial disc?
Yes. I don't think there's any question it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it could happen tomorrow. I mean,
I know.
Look how many artificial discs we're doing. Like literally, I do 2 to 3 a week.
Right.
So it's like, there's no question it's going to happen. And you're exactly right. All it's going to take is a surgeon with a team who has decided they're willing to take the chance to do it. I've had guys, I do the NFL Combine too, where we screen players for the NFL Combine, and we've had players where we've said, this looks too risky, but all it really takes is one team and their medical staff to say, oh, we're willing to take the risk, and willing to do it. And so I think it's literally it's going to happen in the next month to 3 years. I'd be shocked if it was 3 years.
Range.
Oh, wow.
I'll let you know if I'm the one who ends up doing it. All it takes is a player and a team to convince me to do it, and we'll do it tomorrow.
Well, if it happens, we'll have you and the athlete on at some point to kind of discuss that process. So
after they've been doing well back on the field.
Right, exactly. And that's that is still, ultimately as a doctor, we go through all our papers, we go through all the research, the studies. Ultimately, you get a young man or woman. But with the NFL, you get a young man who doesn't know anything about spines and surgery, and they basically just look you in the eyes and they say, "Look, what do you recommend? I trust you. What's best for me?" And that's one of the things I learned from my dad is, taking care of athletes and being on ESPN, all this kind of stuff. It gets really confusing, and there's a lot of factors and medical, legal, and press, and all this kind of stuff. The beautiful thing about our jobs are if you take care of the person, everything else works out, and so ultimately fusion artificial disc, I'm not even that stressful about the topic. I just look at each individual case and what do you think is best for that person and do that.
Right.
And they trust you to do it. So my point about that is that, sometimes I do recommend fusions because I really believe this is what's best for you. This is what's safest. You want to get back and play for 3 years and be safe and be able to provide for your family, do a fusion. Especially if your discs above and below look perfect, you have no pathology at the other levels. I think you're going to last 3 to 5 years. And then if you have an issue, we can potentially do an artificial disc. You retire, you probably still have a great life. And so, that's a big part of how you make the decision.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, that's a wonderful closing line sort of for this discussion too. We really thank you for joining us, and your experience is largely unmatched across the country. And I think that perspective is really important because you're right. The information out there, like ESPN, it's hard to know what to really make of it sometimes because, our athletes and the general population aren't going to be diving into the research we are. And, we have a lot of our anecdotal evidence as well. So, Dr. Watkins, thank you for sharing your perspective with us today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. I'll come back anytime if you want me.
Absolutely. We'll do this again. So
cool.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram at the Athlete Spine. All right. Take care, everyone.
All right, guys.